In this section, I will look at configuring DNS replication. DNS replication is the process of updating DNS records on different servers so that they contain the same data. This occurs in what is called a zone transfer. So, what is a zone transfer? A zone transfer is the transfer of records between DNS servers. A transfer is the process that keeps multiple copies of zones up to date on multiple servers. If you are using Active Directory integrated zones, this process happens between domain controllers with the rest of the Active Directory database. If you are using primary zones, this happens between the primary zone and the secondary zone, or zones. There can only ever be one primary zone. However, you can have as many secondary zones as you wish. You can also have zone transfers between secondary zones and other secondary zones. Finally, you can set up transfers between Active Directory integrated zones and secondary zones. If you don't have your zone transfers set up correctly or they stop working, this can cause problems in your network as the DNS records start to change and clients start not being able to find resources on the network. Once you have worked out which type of zones you want and how many, you need to set up replication. If you use Active Directory integrated zones, the replication will happen with the Active Directory replication because it is stored in Active Directory. In other words, it uses the same schedule as Active Directory. Keep this in mind because if you decide to replicate your Active Directory database outside business hours, your DNS data will also be replicated outside business hours. Also, if for any reason the Active Directory replication fails, so will your DNS zone replication. If you are finding that your Active Directory integrated zones have stopped replicating, check the event viewer for Active Directory related errors. The big advantage with Active Directory integrated zones is that if you need to recover your DNS data and all your DNS servers are not available, all you need to do is install DNS on a working domain controller. If you are using primary or secondary zones, the big thing that you need to do is set security on the zone so that other DNS servers can replicate the data. By default, no one can replicate DNS data from your DNS server. Once your security is set up, the secondary zone needs to perform zone replication to keep its records up to date. First, zone replication can be triggered by the refresh interval expiring. This is set in the Start of Authority record. The next way is when the server holding the secondary DNS zone boots up. The last way replication can happen is when the primary zone notifies the secondary zone that a change has occurred. When this happens, the secondary zone will request a zone transfer from the primary zone. To better understand how zone replications work, let's have a look at how to configure it. To perform this demonstration, I have installed DNS on a domain controller, so I can take advantage of Active Directory integrated zones. To make changes to DNS, first open the DNS admin tool from Administrative Tools under the Start menu. If I expand down to Forward Lookup Zone, you will notice the zone test.local. This was created when Active Directory was installed. To find out more about the zone, right-click on it and select Properties. You will notice at the top, you can see that the type is Active Directory Integrated. Even though the zone type was set during the Active Directory install, you can change it at any time. If I press the Change button, I can change the zone to a secondary or even a stub zone. If I no longer want to store the zone in Active Directory, I can deselect the tick box, Store the zone data in Active Directory. If you don't feel confident storing your zone data in Active Directory, you can feel confident that you can always change your mind at any time and store it in Active Directory or remove it from Active Directory if you're not happy with the result. While the zone is stored in Active Directory, it will automatically be replicated with Active Directory. Currently, the zone data is being replicated to all DNS servers in the domain, but this can be changed by pressing the Change button. If you change the option to All DNS servers in the forest, all controllers in the forest will receive zone replication data from this DNS server. If you have a large forest and a lot of domains and domain controllers, this can become a large amount of data. If you have a requirement for users in other domains in the same forest to resolve DNS names from this zone, consider creating a stub zone. A stub zone will direct DNS queries to an authority DNS server for that domain, but only contains a small amount of data when compared with a complete DNS zone. This allows your users to resolve names in different parts of the forest without a large amount of replication data. If you only need to resolve DNS names in the same domain, select the option All DNS Servers Running on Domain Controllers in this domain. Remember, this will replicate the data to all domain controllers in the domain, but it will not be accessible to your users unless you install DNS on that domain controller. Finally, if you have any Windows 2000 domain controllers, you will need to select the last option. Even though this zone is replicated with Active Directory, if I now go to the Start of Authority tab, you will notice at the top the serial number. The serial number is not required by Active Directory integrated zones, but is used in primary and secondary zones. Each time a record is updated in the DNS zone, the serial number will be incremented. Secondary zones use this serial number to determine which version of the zone data they have. The value refresh interval is used by the secondary zones. A DNS server with a secondary zone will query the primary zone at the refresh interval time, in this case, 15 minutes. Every 15 minutes, a server holding the secondary zone will request the Start of Authority record from the server containing the primary or Active Directory integrated zone. If it finds that the serial numbers are different, the DNS server will request a zone transfer. The retry interval is the time period the secondary DNS zone will wait to retry a zone transfer if the zone transfer fails. The expires after value determines when the DNS server will consider the data unreliable when no zone transfers are occurring. In this case, if after a day no zone transfers to the secondary zone have occurred, the data on the secondary server will be considered to be out of date and thus unreliable. The time to live value will determine how long a cache record will stay on the server before it is forgotten. This does not apply to records in the zone, only records that have been cached from another server in response to a DNS query. These settings are primarily used by secondary zones. Before you can start replicating data to a secondary zone, you need to enable zone transfers. This is done on the Zone Transfers tab. If I select the option Allow Zone Transfers, by default, zone transfers will be allowed to any DNS server that requests one. If you value your DNS records, you will want to set some security on your DNS zone transfers, or anyone who wants your zone data can simply request a zone transfer. If you want to limit who can receive zone transfers, you can select the option Only the following servers. By selecting this option and then pressing the Edit button, I can enter the name of DNS servers that I want to receive zone updates. Notice that when I enter in the name of the DNS server, it is resolved to an IP address. The IP addresses have red X's next to them, but if I expand the dialog box so I can see the message, you can see that it is simply telling us that the DNS server is not an authority for that zone. In simple terms, this means it could not locate the zone on the server because it has not been created yet. Using this method uses the IP address, which could change. If you want to use a DNS name rather than an IP address, you need to select the option Only to servers listed in the Names Servers tab. If you select this option, the servers on the Names Servers tab will be used. On the Names Servers tab, I can press the Add button and enter in the name of DNS servers that I want to use. If I press Resolve, you will notice that, again, the DNS name is resolved to an IP address. When I press OK, you will notice that this time the DNS name is recorded instead of the IP address. Now that I have set up the security of zone replication, I can set up another DNS server to have a secondary zone for this zone. To do this, I can connect to the other DNS server, simply called DNS, by right-clicking on the top of the DNS admin tool and entering in the name of the DNS server. Once connected to the other DNS server, I can create a secondary DNS zone. To do this, right-click on Forward Lookup Zone and select New Zone. Select the option Secondary Zone in the wizard. Once you have done this, you need to enter in the name of the zone. In this case, it is a secondary zone for test.local. Now, all I need to do is enter in the DNS server that is holding the primary zone. In this case, DC1. Once I complete the wizard, the secondary zone will be created. Once the zone is created, a zone transfer should happen right away. If I now expand the zone, you will notice that the zone has been populated with records. If you find that there are no records in the zone, you can always right-click on the zone and select the option Transfer from Master. This will force a zone transfer to happen immediately. With careful planning, your DNS infrastructure should replicate without any issues. However, if it does stop, you may develop problems throughout your network. Make sure you save yourself some troubleshooting headaches by giving your DNS deployment careful thought.